Hello and welcome to this week's On the Spot. I'm Zack Strickland here with John Paul Hampstead, our Director of Passport Research on this Friday. So JP, we've had a really interesting week in the freight market in terms of the fact that volumes seem to be pretty sustained. Tender rejections are starting to increase pretty systematically now at this point. We're well over 7%. We seem to be on that seasonal trajectory to where now we can expect a July the 4th tightening, et cetera. But, what remains in question is this sustainable? Volumes are still well up year over year. We were having this debate earlier about, is July going to be like the traditional July where we see this softening, et cetera? What do you think about some of that?
First, let's just kind of set up like what we see, kind of what's going on in the market, right? So on a national basis, large asset-based carriers are rejecting contracted truckloads at a rate of about 7.5% roughly. Which we think is right, kind of where the inflection point to create inflation in spot markets, kind of broadly speaking. Now that momentum is being led by the West Coast, really. Los Angeles is over 10%. Stockton, I think, is up there above 8%. The tightness is, when we talk about LA as kind of being a heartbeat of the freight economy, and its connections to other freight hubs are really kind of what we keep our eyes on. So Dallas heated up above 7%. Looking at Atlanta next. Chicago started tightening a little bit. Harrisburg, Elizabeth, Miami are all seeing action recently. But this is pretty this feels normal. This feels comfortable. Like this is what June is supposed to do leading up to the holiday, when you have a combination of produce, different kinds of summer retail freight, people taking vacation, drivers maybe on the road, maybe off the road. Road check is always a thing. At least in prior years, it was.
And we didn't have road check this year, so we didn't have a lot of drivers sitting on the side of the road.
I think people kind of they sort of plan to be off the road this month. They take vacations and things like that. So it's hard to once we kind of like get into this pattern that feels like normal seasonality, and then the question is, okay, given all of the volatility we've seen this year, given the out of seasonal sort of patterns, both in terms of capacity and volumes that we've seen so far, will this July, is it different this time, or will it be kind of the same? And by kind of the same, I mean, a rapid easing of capacity, soft volumes, through the month of July before a kind of a August, September recovery.
Their push. Yeah, I think one of the bigger questions to me is, have shippers pulled in enough freight into the country? Do they have that inventory ready? And a lot of the stats say that yes, there is plenty of inventory in the United States right now, but is it the right inventory? A lot of these summer, orders that they normally place back in March and April, they didn't order them. They were canceling those sailings, et cetera. Where, according to Greg Miller, a lot of those sailings are starting to be uncanceled now. And, I think that
just got an announcement yesterday that there are a bunch of sailings that were scheduled to hit the West Coast end of July, got canceled, and now they're back on.
Yeah, so that means that, this Los Angeles, Southern California hotspot may continue throughout July, especially as, some of these sectors are still seeing shortages of supply. For a lot of their goods, especially on the retail sector. The retail sector is coming back like a V-shaped recovery. The industrial sector, not so much just yet. It's going to take a little bit of time, I think, for that one to turn back on.
I had a really good conversation with this company called PortX Logistics. That's really interesting, actually, and they kind of do drayage, transloading, and expedited truckload. And so they have some of their own trucks. They have a brokerage. They broker drayage, but they also have transloading facilities that they control, and they've been kind of saying that there are a lot of shippers that have been trying to make up for lost time to the current, time they lost to the coronavirus, who maybe instead of putting boxes on intermodal trains are actually looking for team capacity to get it into the middle of the country as quickly as possible. So that kind of makes me think that there are at least some, I mean, this is a fairly small company. It's, I think that in their brokerage, in their kind of logistics services division, they've got 50 people. They've got about 90 trucks and another 10 owner ops in kind of the Chicago area. But he talks to a lot of customers, and they're growing, and so they're constantly pitching and asking people what they see, and I just thought that was interesting because that suggests that at least for some verticals, the pressure is still on to get goods in the country, which is obviously positive for transportation prices.
Yeah, and I think obviously some of those sectors have been really overheated. The home improvement sector continues to be a strong spot, as well as food and beverage. Both are moderating somewhat. I think the food and beverage has moderated quite a bit. The home improvement still relatively elevated according to some of the credit card data that you and your team have been looking at. I think these sectors continue to be, a pretty hot spot. My only concern in July is the fact that a lot of these orders that were canceled may translate to softer shipments without having the supply of goods available for some of this. But I do think that we'll see still a positive year over year in July, but with the similar seasonal deceleration off of June.
Interesting. Yeah.
That makes
okay.
sense.
So soft July, like normal, maybe not as bad as 2019. Which was, really low, honestly, in terms of spot activity. It was just dead.
Right.
Okay. And so what should we look for in the next couple of weeks? Is there anything? To me, what's so hard about this period is that there's no real sign or warning or leading indicator of what July might look like. Because it's almost like the freight market kind of breaks after the holiday, right?
Right.
So it's like you're pre-holiday, and then it's sort of there's like a singularity, and then it's like everything that's after the holiday. Like, what does that look like? It's really hard to see through the holiday. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Something that I'm looking at too is, business reopenings.
Yeah.
A lot of people are starting to gradually, and it's a very, slow ramp up process. And a lot of those reopenings, it's more like the curve that I thought that would happen when I was debating Craig Fuller back in May. It looks very similar to the pattern that I saw. Now the freight volumes did one of these, but the business reopenings are much more mild. And I think that that's going to contribute to keeping the market a little bit more elevated as this activity continues to increase slowly.
Yeah, we mentioned Dallas earlier, but Houston, if I think about like places that have sort of aggressively reopened, Texas is one of those places.
Right.
Houston has tender rejections above 7%, which is
Dallas and Houston both this week had a huge expansion of tender rejection rates. The middle of the country in general this week really woke up. Kansas City, Dallas, Houston all had this big awakening event. It's almost like the tightness has transitioned to the middle of the country. Now, we were discussing this a little bit on freight forecasting yesterday with Mike Benson and Kyle Littner about how these spots of the country kind of maybe you don't have any activity in Los Angeles, but your capacity is impacted in Dallas or Atlanta or some other part of the country. And I think that's what we're starting to see now is that a lot of carriers are starting to, really take acceptances out west instead of in the middle of the country.
Yeah, I talked to a broker who said the same thing because he was kind of wondering, it looks like a lot of the spot rates out of LA are starting to moderate and come off their peak, whether that's to Denver or Dallas or Salt Lake City or Las Vegas, they're all kind of curving back down, even as tender rejections went up. And one broker I was talking to said that, a lot of your small carriers that kind of represent that over-the-road spot capacity had been avoiding LA for months when it was super soft and dead. They've returned. The larger asset-based carriers that are rejecting freight are still rejecting freight, but the spot market has gotten a little bit looser just because of the return of that capacity. So that's obviously
basically the word is out.
The word is out. Capacity has gone back to the ports as imports have recovered, at least to a large degree on the West Coast. But because there's a finite amount of capacity that has the potential to create gaps and holes,
right,
kind of in other places in the country. And it sounds like Texas is tightening up a little bit, which is fascinating because you always, I mean, with Houston and the way that the energy industry has gone, you always wonder, like, and again, this is not necessarily reflective of the flatbed demand or anything like that, but it's good to see a large important market doing well, even when an industry that's so closely associated with it is obviously not doing well.
Yeah, and Houston, of course, is a much shorter haul regional market. You don't see a lot of freight leaving Houston going long distances. However, we have started to see, looking at our outbound tender volumes, long haul, tweener, et cetera, anything moving over 450 miles has had a rapid expansion out of Houston here in the last week or so.
Is that connected to the port?
It could be indicative of the port capacity. We've seen a huge expansion of rates into the West Coast from China.
Yeah.
On the spot market there for 40-foot containers, a lot of that pressure has not translated to the East Coast simply because a lot of that Chinese freight is they're just trying to pull it in as fast as they can.
Yeah, that's what we think. So we measure this thing called the Panama spread, which basically it takes your spot rates for 40-foot containers from China, to the East Coast or to the West Coast and to the East Coast. It adds the intermodal leg from LA to Chicago to the West Coast rate, and from Savannah to Chicago to the East Coast rate, to kind of see, maybe from a shipper's perspective, which route is actually cheaper, right? And normally the West Coast is much cheaper. I mean, you've got canal fees, you've got it takes a lot longer. So
if service isn't of the essence, you typically go to the West Coast, or you can go through the canal, go to the East Coast, go through the Suez on the other side of the country, et cetera.
Yeah, and so normally West Coast is much cheaper. Right now it's a lot more expensive. It's like $1,300 more expensive, and it was crazy because we're like, what can possibly be sustaining that gap? Why are they shifting to the East Coast? It's because of the time sensitivity of a lot of the freight that's coming in, because service matters.
And again, airline capacity dramatically reduced. So that service has not been available to a lot of shippers out there, especially as they're trying to supply their inventory.
So you're looking at a lot of the lines are starting these, like, quote unquote fast boat services. They're kind of exploiting the low fuel prices to run fairly small ships. We're talking 5,000, 8,000 TEU ships from China to the West Coast in 12 days. And we're seeing a little bit of that, and that's they're trying to use that to compete against some of the air capacity that's been really challenged, because it's taking literally forever to secure. I mean, I saw something, I think it was Flexport was talking about, no, it was actually C.H. Robinson, recently talking about how it's taken 8 to 14 days to move stuff from Asia to the U.S. by air.
Right.
Just because of the lack of capacity.
And the lack of, they can't get the cut time. So we've got about a minute left here. So let's talk about the next week real quick. So we've got, we're going into traditional summer peak season coming up here. All the signs point to, tender rejection rates going up. They've found their inflection point. Volumes are up a little bit, and they're gradually increasing. Do you think that we are seeing, we're going to see the peak here in the next week as traditional?
Yeah, I do. I do think that markets will take a breather after July, and I think that the depth of that post-holiday trough is going to tell us a lot about how fall is set up. It's going to tell us, whether there's still ample capacity in the market, or whether a lot more capacity has evaporated than some people might have thought.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Obviously we've had a volatile ride, and time will tell. But thanks so much, JP, for coming out this week and talking with me. And thank you for watching. Be sure to check out FreightWaves.com for any future freight market information, as well as all of our streaming available on services such as Apple TV. Everybody, have a great week.